Berlin, Germany. Winter, 1944. Sirens coil across a city that has lived under the arc of searchlights for more than a year. The bomber stream forms before dawn above the North Sea and turns inland. Their contrails ladder the sky from the Dutch coast toward the Oder. Then a new shape arrives in the thin air. Single-engine fighters with long legs and clean lines. North American P-51 Mustangs. They bank above the capital of the Third Reich, where no single-engine escort was expected to endure. The sight is simple and shocking at once. For the defenders, it means the geometry of interception has changed. Head-on attacks that once cracked open unescorted bomber boxes now meet agile escorts already holding the sunline. For the attackers, it means the promise of daylight precision can be kept at ranges that once demanded faith more than fuel. Range has been turned into time on station. Time on station becomes control of the fight. The actors are clear. The United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force flying from East Anglia. The Royal Air Force mounting complementary pressure by night. Opposing them, the Luftwaffe day fighter force spread across fields from Brunswick to Wittenberg to the Oder's Bend. Factories in Berlin and in the ring of engine plants beyond it are the strategic target set. Pilots and controllers on both sides work inside a sky crowded with metal and with decisions measured in seconds. The dates fix the stage. February 1944 brings a sustained blow against aircraft and engine production that crews call Big Week. In March, Berlin becomes a daylight objective. Over those routes, the P-51 arrives with external fuel tanks under each wing and with the altitude performance of a Packard-built Merlin engine that holds power in the cold, thin air. Technology and doctrine converge at scale. This episode asks one hard question. How did a long-range escort appear over Berlin and convert a hazardous aspiration into a routine fact of war? The answer lies in a chain that begins with strategy and passes through leadership and production and logistics before it reaches a gun sight. When that chain holds, the bomber stream reaches the release point with strength to matter. When it holds again, the next day, the defender begins to lose more than aircraft. He begins to lose initiative. In the year 1943, the daylight strategy of the United States Army Air Forces met its hardest test. Deep strikes without consistent escort bled crews and machines at a rate that could not endure. The summer and autumn blows against ball-bearing plants and aircraft works demonstrated the dilemma with tragic clarity. Precision in daylight required mass and persistence. Mass and persistence required survival. Survival at those distances required fighters that could stay with the formation from the North Sea to central Germany and back. The need was strategic before it was technical. Industry answered first with an airframe that carried hope on paper and then in metal. The North American P-51 had fine aerodynamics and long legs in its Allison-powered form at low to medium altitude. Mated to the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin, it became a high-altitude hunter. Supercharger stages kept power in the thin cold above 20,000 feet. A laminar flow wing traded some forgiving behavior for speed and efficiency. The design would mean little without fuel. The solution was external fuel tanks slung beneath each wing. Some were pressed metal. Many were resin-impregnated paper that could be mass-produced and discarded after combat. The moment a pilot jettisoned them near the target, the fighter shed drag and fought clean. The second answer came from command. In January 1944, James Doolittle took over the 8th Air Force Fighter Arm with a simple mission statement. Fighters exist to destroy German fighters. That sentence reoriented behavior in the air. Escorts would still protect the bomber stream. They would also range forward as hunter sweeps when advantage allowed. Aggression replaced close herding. It was a doctrinal pivot that exploited the very range the P-51 offered. The third answer lay across airfields and depots in East Anglia and Midlands counties. Long-range escort is a logistics problem expressed as endurance. Aviation fuel of 100 octane flowed through pipelines, docks, and railheads to grass strips and hardstands. Maintenance crews learned the Merlin's temperaments in winter. Spare parts arrived in crates packed with Cosmoline. Ground controllers married radar plots to squadron arcs with growing fluency. Navigation aids and time gates kept fighter groups and bomber groups on schedule in skies that held hundreds of aircraft. Rescue launches and patrol aircraft fanned beneath the route to pull downed crews from the sea. The system that delivered an escort to Berlin was not one invention. It was a chain of supply and skill. On the other side, the Luftwaffe faced a narrowing corridor of options. Losses among experienced leaders in 1943 had already thinned the cadre that held formations together under pressure. Fuel became scarcer as the year turned. Training hours contracted. New aircraft such as the Bf-109G series and the FW-190A series arrived in numbers that looked large on paper, yet could not erase the pilot deficit. Production was still powerful. Experience was not. Intelligence and planning tied the threads. Photo reconnaissance mapped engine plants and airframe lines from Leipzig to Brunswick to Gotha. Controllers read the pattern of night blows by the Royal Air Force and the day schedules of the Americans, and tried to anticipate the next concentration. In response, Allied planners designed Operation Argument for February 1944. The intent was to strike the cluster of aircraft and engine factories over several days at a tempo that forced the day fighter force to rise again and again. The expectation was not a single decisive day. It was cumulative strain measured in pilots lost and sorties flown and hours not spent training. Weather and seasons set the physical limits. Winter air offered power but punished men and machines. Ground fog could hold a fighter group for an hour and fracture a plan. The planners accepted the friction because the strategic demand was clear. Reduce the day fighter force before the spring campaign and before the armies would need absolute air superiority over France. When the calendar rolled into March, the target list widened to the capital. To reach Berlin in strength and to protect the bomber stream required the full maturity of this buildup. Airframe, engine, external fuel tank, doctrine, logistics. Only when all of them aligned would a pilot lift his eyes above the city haze and see what the defenders would remember. Single-engine escorts where none had endured before. Before dawn on March 6, 1944, the concrete at East Anglia glittered with frost and fuel. Crews filed into briefing huts where a single thread was drawn across a wall map from England to Berlin, Germany, and back. The plan placed heavy bombers in several combat wings with time gates to assemble over designated beacons before crossing the North Sea. Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress groups and consolidated B-24 Liberator groups would climb in steps to a working altitude above 20,000 feet. Fighter cover would begin as the stream reached the Dutch coast and would continue in relays deep into Germany. The final escort legs were assigned to North American P-51 Mustang groups, whose range with external fuel tanks made the objective possible. At first light, airfields stirred from Norfolk to Suffolk. Ground crews pulled chocks and signaled with torches as bombers lumbered to the runway. The takeoff schedule staggered minutes between units to prevent wake turbulence and to feed the assembly sequence. Fighters launched on a later clock, so they would intercept the bomber stream near the Zuiderzee and avoid unnecessary loitering. Each P-51 carried 2 external fuel tanks beneath the wing's fuel to be burned first and a standing order to jettison only when combat demanded. Radio discipline kept chatter to brevity codes as formations formed over their beacons and moved east in stacked boxes that balanced mutual support with the need to keep clear air for gunners. Over the North Sea, the air smoothed and temperatures fell. The escort's first task was geometry. Leaders placed squadrons ahead and above the lead elements of the bomber stream, where an opponent would appear as a speck against the sun. Elements to the flanks guarded climbing attacks from the side quadrants that had proven lethal in the previous year. A second wave of fighters cruised slightly lower to meet any opponent that punched through the first curtain. The bombers held course markers and speed targets that allowed navigators to meet the strict minute marks required to carry hundreds of aircraft across the same gate without collision. German radar stations along the coast and inland plotted the stream by mid-morning and passed vectors to day fighter groups based around Leeuwarden and Jever, and then deeper toward Brunswick and Magdeburg. Controllers preferred a high head on attack, where closure rates shortened exposure to defensive fire. On this day, the escorts were already in position. As the first Messerschmitt Bf-109 formations began to climb for an intercept line, the forward P-51 elements rolled out of the sun in slashing passes that forced the German units to break early and lose the cohesion required for a massed strike. Focke-Wulf FW-190 units shifted to a plan for quartering attacks from the beam, only to find the escort's second wave waiting at the correct altitude band. The bomber stream crossed the Dutch coast with contrails painting the sky into white ropes that both sides could read like tracks in snow. Over the Osnabrück and Hanover corridors, flak belts thickened. The escorts adjusted spacing to avoid flying directly through predicted barrage zones, then reclosed as the bombers cleared the heaviest concentrations. The P-51 groups flew economy settings on external fuel until the fuel checks confirmed the arithmetic. Only then did section leaders call for a selective drop of the tanks, turning a long-range cruiser back into a clean fighter. Climb rates sharpened, turns tightened. The escorts executed brief sweeps ahead of the stream to disrupt assembly points that German controllers used to marshal a second attempt. Approach to the capital demanded a tighter weave of rolls. The bomber groups opened formation intervals for the bomb-run navigators, adjusting headings against high-altitude winds. Escort leaders placed one component high and forward to keep the path clear, another abreast at mid-altitude to kill any late leakers, and a reserve ready to dive on any opponent approaching from below and astern. The city haze over Berlin reduced contrast and made spotting difficult. Pilots relied on sun-glint silhouette and the abrupt kink of contrails to pick up movement. When the first bursts of heavy anti-aircraft fire climbed in clockwork ladders, the escorts steered for gaps and refused the instinct to loiter over the most dangerous batteries. The mission remained the same. Keep pressure on the day fighter force and keep the bomber bays unmolested until the toggles fell. Bomb release over the industrial districts and rail yards was a matter of minutes. In those minutes, the intercept geometry finally collapsed for the defender. Every serious head-on attempt ran into a fighter screen. Every vertical dive from above found a high cover already in position. The few attackers who broke through reached the edges of the bomber boxes and faced overlapping arcs of defensive guns. Individual combats flared and ended quickly. The Packard-built Merlin engines in the escorts held power in the thin air and allowed short climbs and dives that punished any opponent caught at the wrong energy state. German pilots who survived the first merge often extended away to regroup only to be pressed by fresh elements arriving from the second escort wave. Egress demanded a different discipline. The bombers tightened into withdrawal shapes and turned for a planned exit corridor that avoided the heaviest known anti-aircraft concentrations. The escorts split duties again. Some units stayed tight to the stream for the first 40 miles to deter late interceptions. Others executed controlled sweeps toward airfields on the probable German recovery line, striking as opponents landed low on fuel. These forward actions were brief and bounded by fuel totals. Leaders called their groups back to the stream at pre-planned time gates to ensure that no squadron arrived at the North Sea coast on an empty gauge. As the formations crossed back over the Dutch shoreline, the contrails thinned in warmer air, and the radios relaxed by a degree. The external fuel calculus reversed for the final leg. Those who had managed fuel with care still carried a margin for a short patrol above the route. Those who had fought hard, trimmed power, leaned mixtures, and accepted a lower altitude for the return. Air-sea rescue craft and patrol aircraft traced the line home, a quiet assurance that altered risk calculus for both sides. The last escorts peeled away over the North Sea and descended toward English fields now weeping with thaw. 2 days later, the pattern repeated with refinements learned in blood and debrief. The timing of the fighter handovers moved a fraction earlier. The altitude, split between high and mid-cover, widened to protect against a renewed effort at vertical ambush. Controllers on the Allied side adjusted radio procedures to keep bomber and fighter nets clearer during the Berlin phase. The German response adapted as well, with attempts to mass farther from the capital and then rush the stream near the target. In practice, each attempt met a curtain of escorts that reached deeper than any single relay could have managed the previous year. These opening moves did not resemble a cinematic turning of a single key. They looked like procedure enforced at scale. Precise takeoff tables, assembly over beacons, altitude bands assigned and flown. External fuel burned on schedule and jettisoned by need. Fighter elements positioned where geometry and sun would punish the first climb of the defender. Bomb bays opened and closed on time. Withdrawal executed on a corridor chosen for survivability rather than pride. When the last aircraft rolled to a stop on English concrete in the fading light, The ledger was not measured only in losses. It was measured in the fact that an objective once beyond escort had been reached and struck under watchful guns, and that the system could do it again. The decisive moment arrived not as a single duel above the city, but as a sequence of command decisions that changed the shape of every duel that followed. Before first light, the fighter group leaders repeated the same sentence that had begun to govern their trade. Fighters exist to destroy German fighters. That directive liberated timing. Instead of orbiting the bomber boxes as close guardians from takeoff to target leading elements now moved forward along predicted interception lines, the escorts became pressure applied in advance of contact. The effect compounded when the heavy bomber stream neared the capital and the day fighter force climbed to meet it. What had once been a reliable head-on blow now met an ambush set one step earlier in the geometry. Execution depended on minutes and on discipline. As the stream crossed Germany's section, leaders called fuel checks and confirmed that external tanks had been run down to the agreed mark. At the first sighting of a climbing formation, the order snapped across radios to drop the tanks. The Mustangs shed drag like a bird losing ballast and turned into clean fighters. Leaders split squadrons into a high cover that held the sun and a cutting group that rolled into the intercept path. The first pass was designed to slice a climbing formation before it fused. If the enemy broke early, the attack lost mass and timing. If the enemy held discipline, the escorts repeated the cut again from a different perch, forcing a trade that favored the faster climber with more power at altitude. On March 8, this logic played out above Berlin. German controllers assembled fighters west of the city for a surge into the bomber stream. The maneuver required seconds of steady climb and coordination by hand and voice. The forward escorts arrived just as the surge began to cohere. From the sunline, the cutting elements made short diving passes that cracked the leading Staffel and forced separation. The high cover stayed patient, guarding against the counter-dive that could follow a successful pass. Each contact lasted a handful of heartbeats. Each forced turn consumed fuel and altitude that could not be recaptured without time the defenders did not have. Meanwhile, the bomber groups opened their intervals and settled onto the run. The decisive action was not only the destruction of individual aircraft, it was the induced failure of an interception plan built on precise timing. Doctrine met technology again, at the point where an escort could leave the boxes and hunt. When radio reports showed the bomber stream meeting little pressure at a given phase, leaders pushed elements ahead to the next airfield line on the German recovery route. There, the escorts found opponents landing low on fuel or climbing with partial formations for a second attempt. Short strafing runs at the approach ends of runways and at dispersal tracks did more than damage aircraft on the ground. They added friction to a system already straining under fuel rationing and instructor losses. A unit delayed on the ground by a torn runway surface or a damaged taxi track could not meet the next vector call. The pressure rolled forward by hours and by counties. The turning point depended as much on restraint as on aggression. An escort that chased too far from the stream could leave a gap for a late interception. Leaders carried small pieces of paper in flight gloves listing time gates and fuel minima. When the numbers hit those marks, even a successful hunter turn ended with a call to return to the corridor. That discipline is what permitted the offensive doctrine without exposing the heavy bombers to a sudden empty sky. It is also what allowed a second and third mission in the same week. The decisive action was cumulative and repeatable, not theatrical. On the German side, commanders faced unhappy arithmetic. To mass a force strong enough to break a protected stream, they needed to gather formations from several fields and feed them into altitude at the right moment. That meant scheduled takeoffs and a climb window. Radar range and radio control could sketch the plan. The escorts exploited the sketch. A single squadron appearing 5 minutes early in the climb lane could scatter the first formation and force the second to choose between pressing an uncoordinated attack or burning fuel to reassemble. Both choices ended in worse odds. As spring advanced, the airfields themselves became predictable targets. Even when fighters managed to rise in good order, they met opponents that could match their altitude band and then outlast them above 20,000 feet, where the Packard-built Merlin kept power in the cold. Fuel turned from a planning factor into a constraint with operational consequences. Shortages in high-octane stock reduced training flights and shortened patrol windows. Many defenders lifted with partial loads to keep takeoff weights safe on winter fields, a choice that reduced endurance in the sky where the fight now lasted longer. The escorts arrived with external tanks to spend and a reserve after jettison for the fight. In engagements that stretched across many minutes, the side with fuel to trade could dictate when to press and when to extend. The bombers benefited indirectly. The longer the escort could remain over the target area, the fewer attackers could assemble at the decisive time. Communication practices marked another shift. Allied controllers learned to keep fighter and bomber nets cleaner during the critical approach and egress periods. Short call signs and set phrases shortened radio time and reduced confusion in the haze above the city. German controllers working under pressure and often under attack near their own airfields struggled to maintain clarity as formations were split by early cuts. Misheard vectors and repeated instructions cost seconds that mattered more than rhetoric. The decisive action was not eloquence. It was the bald fact that one side could pass cleaner instructions to units that still existed as intact formations. Weather, which had often been the ally of the defender, did not rescue the day. The haze over Berlin reduced spotting range, but it reduced it for both sides, and the escorts had already taken the high perches, where silhouette and sun gave them a modest edge. Anti-aircraft fire climbed in regular ladders and forced both escorts and attackers to weave, yet the escorts were not required to dive into the heaviest batteries to do their work. Their job was to spoil the massing and to kill any leakers. By holding their altitude bands and refusing to be dragged low, they preserved energy and lives. The bomb run continued. The pattern held. By the time the egress began, the decision had been made in a way that historians sometimes miss when they look only for a named dogfight or a famous ace. The bomber stream turned for home with losses, but not with disaster. The defenders had taken casualties in the air and damage on the ground. More importantly, they had spent energy, time, and fuel without achieving concentration. The escorts divided again into close cover and forward sweeps toward the recovery line and executed planned strikes measured in seconds rather than in bravado. When they returned to the corridor at the time gate and found the stream intact, the point was proved. The new doctrine worked under fire. Two conclusions became unavoidable inside the fighter huts and command posts on both sides. The first was that long-range escorts had ended the period when the defender could choose the place and moment of decisive contact. The second was that attrition now favored the side with deeper training pipelines and industrial depth. Every day that the system could put Mustangs over Berlin and keep bomber groups intact was a day that training hours in Germany went unflown, and experienced leaders were not replaced at full value. The turning point then was not a single flash of action, but a sustained rebalancing of initiative. It began the week of the first raids and continued until the day fighter force in the West could no longer contest the sky en masse. In later retellings, a single sentence became a marker for this change. The claim that the sight of Mustangs over the capital meant the war in the air was lost. Whether the phrasing was ever spoken exactly is less important than the operational truth it points to. When single-engine escorts could appear over Berlin in numbers, remain long enough to break the intercept, and return to do it again on the next mission, the strategic mathematics shifted. From that week forward, the defender fought on terms he did not set. The decisive action was the system itself working as designed at scale. The first consequence was procedural and immediate. Debrief rooms in East Anglia filled with crews who had reached Berlin, Germany, and returned in organized formations. The tally sheets recorded losses that were serious, but not crippling. The distinction mattered. A force that could absorb a difficult day and still place crews back into barracks to fly again the next morning possessed momentum. Operations officers adjusted the next set of routes with pencil marks and moved time gates by minutes rather than by hours. The machine of daylight bombing had shown that it could carry its weight to the heart of the Reich and live. That confidence, once earned, changed planning across the next season. For the day fighter force defending Germany, the consequences registered as friction compounded. Controllers reported that head-on tactics no longer achieved the concentrated strikes that had broken unescorted raids the year before. Squadron diaries recorded increasing instances of partial contacts of single elements, driven off or dragged into energy-wasting turns, while the main bomber streamed past. Airfields that served as recovery points were hit by short strafing passes at vulnerable moments, damaging dispersal tracks and fuel bowsers, and leaving aircraft idle with minor wounds that nevertheless consumed mechanics and hours. In a system already constrained by fuel, each delay had a ripple effect. A fighter that did not take off on time could not join the altitude gate that made a mass. A unit that launched late arrived piecemeal and paid for that delay in blood. Industrial consequences followed the aircraft to their targets. Engine plants and airframe lines around Leipzig and Brunswick and Gotha sustained repeated strikes in February and March. Repairs remained possible, but the repair cycle lengthened as damage overlapped and transport lines frayed. The rail yards that connected component factories to final assembly points became regular aim points. Each cut track lengthened repair queues and forced improvisations that could not scale. The escort's presence over Berlin and over the web of rail and canal links that fed it made the larger pressure credible. When daylight missions can return to a target group inside the capital in a matter of days, dispersion and camouflage become coping measures rather than solutions. A second-order consequence unfolded in training. The German day fighter force had endured heavy losses in 1943 among combat leaders. The spring of 1944 took more of that experience away, just as the pipeline of new pilots contracted under fuel rationing. Hours in type fell. Conversion to late models of the Bf-109 and the FW-190 sometimes occurred on the line rather than in a measured course. New pilots climbed into combat with fewer hours and met opponents who now held altitude and tactical initiative. The attrition was not only numerical, it was qualitative. Every experienced Staffelkapitän who failed to return represented years of institutional memory that could not be replaced at speed. The bomber offensive registered its own ledger. Reaching Berlin with escort did not erase losses. Crews were killed, aircraft were missing, and machines that limped home on 2 engines did not fly the next day. Yet the ratio of loss to effort shifted in favor of persistence. That shift enabled a broader campaign. Oil targets that had been on paper for months moved to the active list. By late spring, refineries, hydrogenation plants, and storage depots across central and eastern Germany were under repeated daylight pressure. The appearance of escorts over the capital did not cause the oil shortages that would later cripple training and operations by itself. It enabled the regularity and depth of strikes that made those shortages inevitable. On the ground in Berlin, the civilian consequence was familiar by then, yet newly demoralizing. Sirens rose, anti-aircraft batteries spoke, bombers passed. What changed for observers on rooftops and at tram stops was the sight of single-engine fighters cruising where once only twin-engine night fighters or heavy bombers had roamed. The symbolism carried weight beyond tactics. If the capital's daylight sky could host hostile escorts in strength, the protective distance of geography had been annulled. That knowledge traveled in rumor and in overheard fragments of military conversations. It was not propaganda. It was a visual fact. Allied planning shifted to exploit the new reality. With escorts able to range far ahead, commanders refined the practice of fighter sweeps that targeted airfields, assembly points, and choke nodes on rail lines during the ingress and egress of bomber missions. These were not indiscriminate hunts. They were mapped against the rhythm of German control procedures. A short attack at the correct minute could ruin a carefully built intercept. The practice also imposed an administrative burden. Damaged perimeter tracks and cratered runway ends required repair teams, material, and time. Every unit of labor spent on patches and on dispersal bay repairs was a unit not spent on building hardened shelters or on improving navigation aids or on instructor time for trainees. The political consequence appeared in command conversations. Senior leaders in Germany had long argued about resource allocation between night interception, day fighters, and anti-aircraft artillery. The spring experience over Berlin shifted that argument toward more guns and more dispersal at the expense of an already strained day fighter force. Guns and searchlights could deny altitude at a fixed point. They could not pursue a bomber stream across provinces or break an escort screen that understood their patterns. The shift represented a defensive reflex that offered a measure of psychological assurance, yet yielded few strategic returns. In London and at United States Army Air Force's headquarters, the consequence was confidence to adopt the transport plan ahead of the cross-channel invasion. Rail junctions, bridges, and marshalling yards in France and Belgium became day targets in the late spring. The same system that had delivered Mustangs to Berlin now delivered them over Paris and Lille and the lower Seine again and again. The day fighter force in the west faced a cruel choice: rise to defend the rear area and meet escorts with altitude and numbers, or conserve fuel for the next desperate effort against the invasion fleet. Either choice bled strength. When June arrived, the invasion met limited resistance from the air in daylight. That outcome was not an accident of weather alone. It was the downstream effect of months in which escorts had taught the day fighter force that climbing to meet a guarded stream was a losing proposition. Technological counters did appear. New rocket armament for interceptors offered a way to shatter bomber boxes without long exposure. Jet development promised speed that escorts might not match at altitude. These measures, introduced under pressure, suffered from the same resource traps as the rest of the system. Rocket strikes were lethal when well executed, but required calm assembly and a clean approach that escorts worked to spoil. Jets demanded fuel of high-quality long runways and careful maintenance. They also needed pilots trained to a new regimen. In an economy already strained, each of those prerequisites landed like a weight. The few jets that reached the sky in spring and summer were not enough to reverse the pressure. They were signs of ingenuity arriving late to a fight that had shifted beneath them. The consequence most visible to aircrew was a change in radio tone. The approach to target and the bomb run on the March raids over Berlin had been tight with stress. By late spring, over other deep targets, there were still alarms and losses, but also stretches of controlled quiet in which procedures flowed. Fighter controllers and group leaders spoke in short phrases. The knowledge that a forward sweep was already cutting assembly lanes before the bomber stream arrived reduced the sharp edge of dread. The end of fear never came. The edge dulled enough to permit routine, and routine is the oxygen of a sustained campaign. Strategically, the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin marked a handover from experiment to system. What had been argued in memoranda as theory now worked as weekly practice. Air superiority in daylight did not mean the absence of enemies. It meant the presence of a structure that forced the enemy to fight on unfavorable terms. With that superiority, the Allies could pursue multiple campaigns at once: oil transport, aircraft production, and direct battlefield isolation. Each of those lines of effort amplified the others. Fuel shortages degraded pilot training and limited operational sorties. Damaged rail yards constrained repair flows and troop movements. Repeated losses among experienced day fighter leaders fractured unit cohesion just when field armies needed consistent air cover. The consequences converged in a summer where Allied armies moved under a sky that was hostile to the defender by default. For Germany, the longer-term consequence was the acceptance of a defensive posture that sought survival rather than decision. Factories were dispersed. Some production went underground. Night fighters took on greater relative importance. Yet none of those measures could compensate for the loss of initiative in daylight. Civil defense grew more organized as shelters were improved and fire services hardened, but these adaptations addressed effects rather than causes. The cause lay in the ability of Allied air power to enter at will, to linger, and to leave with manageable loss. That ability had been proven over Berlin. Proof changed behavior. By autumn of 1944, the phrase air superiority in the West meant an operational fact that commanders on the ground could plan around. The chain that began with long-range escort over Berlin extended across bridges on the Meuse and depots at Aachen, and columns moving by daylight in the Low Countries. For those inside the Luftwaffe, the consequence was a daily routine of hard decisions, of launching on partial fuel, of choosing to commit a handful of veterans to impossible odds to steady the hands of novices. For those at East Anglia, the consequence was a schedule pinned to briefing hut walls with targets listed for the week ahead. The war in the air did not end in March. It became winnable on a calendar. That is the harshest and most consequential outcome of the moment, when single-engine escorts first circled above the capital and stayed long enough to matter. Historians broadly agree on the essentials. Long-range escort combined with offensive doctrine broke the day fighter defense in Western Europe. The technical piece was endurance at altitude. The operational piece was the freedom to leave the bomber boxes and hunt. Together, they forced the defender to fight on unfavorable terms from March 1944 through the summer. This change did not end the war in the air by itself. It made every other Allied line of effort more effective. The oil campaign cut flying hours. The transport plan constricted repair flows and troop movement. Field armies crossed France under a canopy that the defender could not pierce in daylight with consistency. Debates remain, and they are worth stating clearly. Loss figures for individual days vary by source and method. The famous line often attributed to a German leader about Mustangs over the capital is contested in wording and context. The relative weight of types is also argued. Thunderbolt and Lightning groups carried heavy loads in the months before and after the Berlin raids, and many analysts insist that the shift in doctrine mattered as much as the airframe. Others press the question of strategic bombing's efficiency against dispersed industry. They argue that oil and transport were the real levers and that escort mainly enabled pressure to land where it counted. These arguments refine rather than reverse the core judgment. When single-engine escorts could appear over the capital in numbers, the timetable of German decline shortened. The longer legacy lies in doctrine. Offensive counter-air, as practiced afterward, carries the pattern first proven here. Gain endurance. Take the high perches. Break the intercept before it forms. Deny recovery. The emphasis on fuel logistics on training hours and on the health of instructor cadres is another durable lesson. A fighter force dies twice. Once in the air, once in the classroom when hours run dry. The Berlin escorts illuminated that truth for planners who later built peacetime air forces around resilient pipelines of people parts and fuel. There is also a cultural memory that endures. For Allied aircrew, the sight of friendly fighters above deep targets became a sign that procedure, not hope, governed survival. For civilians in Germany, the same sight signaled that distance no longer defended the capital in daylight. In both cases, the image carries more weight than any single kill tally. It captures a system arriving at maturity. Airframes and engines mattered. External tanks mattered. Radios and rescue grids mattered. Most of all, disciplined timing turned all of them into power. Assessments written after 1945 tend to converge on a spare conclusion. The first appearance of long-range escorts over Berlin marked the handover of initiative. From that week, the defender responded rather than decided. That is why the moment belongs in the short list of pivots in the European air war. One line to hold on to. Long-range escorts over Berlin turned distance from shield to liability and made daylight air superiority a repeatable fact.